You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 143. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Barbera, and today I get to talk to a really interesting person. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Berens, who has a PhD, and she is a scientist and educator. She's the founder of Fit Learning, which has 37 locations around the world, and it's a powerful system where she helps transform learning for kids who are struggling, for average kids, for gifted kids, and for kids that have learning disabilities, including those on the spectrum. She mostly serves kids who are fully conversational and having academic problems, but we talk about kids on the spectrum, whether they should get diagnosed with learning disabilities, how much we should push reading and other academics. And we talk about her book called Blind Spots and really how we can move the educational process for all kids forward so that everybody can learn easier and more efficiently. So let's get to this important episode with Dr. Kimberly Berens. Okay, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure just to talk to you for a couple minutes to plan this podcast interview. So thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I followed your work a little bit way back when. So why don't you tell our listeners how you got into this whole ABA world? You're not really in the autism world per se, but how did you get involved with ABA?
Well, so I did start in the autism world. That was my whole, that's how I got into the field. I was at Rollins College, which is a small liberal arts college in Florida, and was lucky enough to meet my mentor, my undergraduate mentor, Maria Ruiz. And she was a behavior scientist and was more in basic and theoretical work, but she kind of guided me to my clinical mentor that, my sophomore year of college. Started working in a treatment center for adults with profound disabilities as a sophomore in college. Ed Blakely was his name, Dr. Blakely. And so I worked with him for several years and had the opportunity to open a school for kids with autism with him. And this was back in the 90s when there wasn't a lot of ABA programs, especially early intervention programs for children on the spectrum. So that was a really amazing opportunity. So I started in that whole world and actually went to UNR for University of Nevada, Reno for my PhD and ran their autism program for several years. So I did start in that whole realm. And then I eventually expanded beyond autism into really mainstream education areas. And, I was always amazed by the impact that behavior science could make on children's lives who did have profound disabilities. But then I was always dismayed that it wasn't the way school goes for all kids. And it wasn't the way teachers are trained. I mean, because behavior science applies to all human learning, not just children with disabilities. So I wanted to expand my work into more populations. And so that's how Fit Learning came to be.
Yeah. And I've done some additional training with my mentor, Dr. Rick Cavina, and we've had Janet Twyman on the show. And I know these people are very familiar to you and you've worked hand in hand with them. You were very big and are very big in precision teaching and fluency-based instruction. And you're really out in the general population. And also there's a whole lot of kids with learning disabilities that are labeled or unlabeled. But that is the population that you serve in terms of, where you're at right now. So you founded the Fit Learning organization. So why don't you tell us what that is? Because I don't know anything about that. I've heard about it. Why don't you tell us what it is and where it's at?
Yes. So, I started Fit Learning as a graduate student, a doctoral student at UNR, just like I mentioned, in 1990, actually in a janitor's closet. It's like the only space that UNR had available for me to turn into a makeshift, session room. So I just started working with mainly children of UNR faculty. And we started it in the math area. So we started applying behavioral science to instruction in mathematics. And then we gradually, every year got more and more interest, expanded beyond just faculty just kids of faculty and into the community. More people were interested, and we developed a reading program and so on and so forth. But eventually we had gotten to the point where we were in competition with an after-school tutoring program that the College of Education provided to the community. And unfortunately, there was a little bit of a contentious thing there where the folks over in the education department thought that people in behavior science didn't have any business working with kids in academic areas. So we were and they had a lot of money. The College of Ed at UNR is a very, very powerful program. They get a lot of grant money. And unfortunately, as usual, the behavior analysis program is a little smaller, a little less influential. So we got voted off campus, unfortunately, which was sad. So at that point, I was devastated because I wasn't getting paid anything, and I had just volunteered. I was actually still doing my autism work, but I was doing this on the side. So that's when my husband and I, Nick Berens, who's also a co-founder of FIT, we decided to approach the university and request that we were able to privatize the program off campus and maintain in a university affiliation, which they allowed us to do. So that's actually how FIT became FIT. And we started as just one little center in Reno. And now we have a formal certification in our method of instruction. And we have 37 locations around nationally and in other parts of the world. And we currently move children a year and 40 hours of instruction. So, regardless of their classification, regardless of the type of learner they are, we move kids that rapidly because we apply behavioral science to instruction.
Let me just explain in case somebody is out there and they don't understand that. So basically, if Johnny is technically in 5th grade, but he's reading at a 2nd grade level, and I bring Johnny to one of your FIT locations, you are seeing on average in 40 hours of instruction, he will move from a 2nd grade reading level to a 3rd grade reading level in 40 hours.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And you can do that with reading, with math.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. So we target core. So we don't do content courses like science or social studies. We train all the core kind of competencies that kids have to be able to acquire academic skills in any area. So we have a FIT reading program, a FIT math program. We do training in writing and composition, grammar. And then we also have something called FIT Logic, which is really training critical thinking, inferencing, comprehension, advanced language skills. So we have all those main core areas. And again, we work with, every kind of kid. So I have kids who have an actual real neurological learning disability. And then I have kids who've been classified with one and it's not real. They've just been instructionally failed by their school. And then I have kids who have no label at all. They're just average or struggling a little bit. And they're, again, average and struggling because their school is not provided the right kind of instruction. And then I also have high aptitude kind of accelerated kids who need more of a challenge and more acceleration. So I have, the whole range of learners we have enrolled at FIT.
So you have 37 locations. And are these tutoring centers, or are they just one person? Or are they a whole team at all 37 locations?
Yeah. So, so this is how it works. So we don't own all those locations. I mean, or else I'd be in the grave with gray hair. Well, I already have gray hair. I'd have more gray hair than I already have. So we have a licensing and certification model. So people who are interested in pursuing this work, more often than not, they're BCBAs. They're people in the behavior analysis world. Sometimes they're not. I mean, we have an occupational, a PhD level occupational therapist who runs our Chicago and London locations. We have some school psychologists who've gotten involved with us. Regardless of your background, more often than not, they're in our field, but they may be in a field of education or a related field. and they find out about us, they find out about this work, and they this is what they want to do with their lives. They approach us, and then there's a whole vetting process. And if they get through the vetting process, then they can begin a training and certification program. So that's really the first phase. So they go through intensive training and certification in our model. And once they achieve that, which is actually based on a measurable level of proficiency, it's not just time, it's not finishing modules, it's actually audited, measured proficiencies and competencies that are achieved, and production of a year's growth in 40 hours of training with a learner. They have to meet that requirement in order to achieve certification, because that's our minimum standard of gain. Then they're certified, and then they can open a location in their area, and they license our brand and all of our intellectual property. And then in order to maintain their license, they have to meet our quality assurance standards, which is to continue producing that level of growth with their kids enrolled. And then there's different levels of certification. So they become certified eventually as trainers, so they can train their own teams. And so most of our established locations have, teams that they have certified learning coaches, which is what our initial kind of our first level, our first rung providers are people who run sessions, and they're called learning coaches. And so they can certify their own teams of learning coaches, their own case managers, their own case advisors. So they build their own teams, and they're just licensed with us. So it's not a franchise. Franchising is very hard to control quality inside of when you're in service provision. If you're talking about flipping hamburgers, that's one thing. But when you're talking about implementing a science-based method of instruction, it's very different. So it's a license and not a franchise. So that's how we've grown. So my husband and I own and operate all the ones in the tri-state area. But then, and our partners operate the Reno office, Dr. Donnie and Kendra Newsome. But then the rest of these are owned by affiliates, and they're their own businesses, but they pay licensing fees, and they pay to become trained and certified in our model.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of our listeners here are parents or professionals that work with kids, where my specialty and my books are focusing on kids with 1 to 5-year-old level of language, whether
Right.
are a toddler or preschooler with some delays, or whether they are a older child, a teen, or even an adult. My son, for instance, Lucas, is 25 years old, and he's functioning at a 1 to 5-year-old level in terms of language. So
Right.
We had talked a little bit before we hit record, and you do work with kids who are at a certain communication level. That
Yes.
do they need to be conversational? Do they need to have how much language? And we can talk about like what to do for the population that is probably, the parents and professionals are listening, which
Right.
seems different than the population that you are going to target. So, what is the baseline cutoff for the kids you serve in terms of language?
So we definitely work with kids who have, various language disabilities or classifications of language disabilities, including those kids on the autism spectrum. However, those, kids who come to fit, they really have to have some prerequisite skills. Most of the time, they're already somewhat conversational. They can answer social questions. They can ask social questions, but they might not be able to expand on social questions. And they definitely aren't engaging in inference. So I would say that what we're the most known for, and actually what we're uniquely contributing in the space of working with children with autism, is moving kids into that realm of abstraction, that abstract thinking realm, where we actually have a curriculum for training concept learning. Because that's one of the biggest issues with kids who have pre-existing language disabilities is their ability to really learn a concept versus rotely perform a skill. Like you can teach a lot of kids to memorize a math fact, right? But it's different to have them understand the process of adding and subtracting at a conceptual level. So, there's actually a core capacity, a core skill set required for kids to actually be able to learn concepts of that sort. And so one of the, the kids who come into our program that are kind of they're just transitioning into a school placement. They've transitioned out of an intensive early intervention program. They are starting to engage in some social skills. But that type of thinking hasn't been established. So those kids come in and do a lot of work just around how to learn concepts. And, they receive training in that way so that being able to be a concept learner is a skill in and of itself. And then once we've established that, then we can use concept instruction to expand their language repertoire, expand their understanding of concepts so that there's, generativity, which is really the goal. So, whenever you're in precision teaching, like I am, or direct, I use precision teaching and direct instruction in everything I do. The whole premise of that type of instruction is generative instruction. And what we mean by that, and I'm sure your other guests like Rick and Janet Twyman have mentioned this as well, but that's the hallmark of an approach like ours is not having to rotely one by one train every single skill in a child's repertoire. It's identifying the critical skills that if you train those well, meaning you train those to fluency and true mastery, you get a lot of things for free. So you get these emerging skills that happen in an untrained manner, and it just rapidly expands the repertoire. And so we have an entire curriculum for that inside of concept learning. We have a descriptive, a describing curriculum that, again, massively expands descriptive language repertoires, beyond naming and answering questions about a picture. It's putting a picture in front of a child and having them being able to describe it in detail on their own without having to be prompted with questions. Something that we call in behavioral science, not to use a weird term, but something called a free operant, or the kid is guiding that description rather than the teacher. So one of the hallmarks of the fit learning approach with respect to children on the spectrum is moving it outside of teacher guided, more into the context or the world occasions responding, because that's one of the biggest differences between an early intervention program and then jumping into a classroom is, in early intervention, it's so much teacher guided, explicit instruction that's teacher guided. And then, but what you want to have happen is that instructional control being transferred to the context, so that the context occasions language, the context occasions talking, asking questions, answering questions, initiating conversations. So we have our program is designed in that way to rapidly expand language repertoires with those kinds of kids.
Yeah, when you brought up direct instruction, I was thinking, I know your kids, the students that you see are past early intervention and they're past the BB map. So they're on the other side of the BB map, which if kids get to level 3 of the BB map and, they're in my verbal behavior bundle courses, I mean, I do have a lesson on language for learning and language for thinking.
Right.
And do you use those curriculum, or is your curriculum kind of beyond that, or supplements that, kind of sort of that, but different?
Yeah. So we definitely don't. I mean, we don't use those curricula. So our Fit Logic program is based on all of things that we've designed for the last 20 years.
Okay.
And it's based on a branch of behavior analysis that's called relational frame theory, which I don't want to again scare people off because that sounds really scary. But it's basically the behavior analysis of language and cognition that is more delving into really inferential, abstracted, language skills. And so we've developed all of those things. So when you talk about direct instruction, which is the number one most effective way to teach concepts with learners, right? As we know, but you have to have a child with the ability to do that. So, right. For example, the bottom rung of our concept learning curriculum is, which you'll probably be familiar with, but bidirectional responding. So, for instance, like an XY or term definition relationship. And one of the first things we teach is for a child to be able to say, like, if I said a hammer is a tool, if I just gave them some simple definition, a hammer is a tool. right? And I presented that to them. And I said, so what is a hammer? And the child could say a tool. But then what is very important is for me to be able to say, so what's a type of tool? And the child to say a hammer. So I know this sounds really silly, but the flexibility of a child to be able to hear a term, say the definition, hear the definition, say the term, that's really like, and we call that bidirectional responding. And there's another really weird, crazy term that I won't use that's actually from RFT. It's called mutual entailment, but whatever, we're not going to go there. Bidirectional responding is way easier to understand. That alone is something that a lot of children can't do. Not just kids on the spectrum, but there are a lot of, like we work with a lot of little learners, 3 to 5 years old, and we start this early with them. So they become really good concept learners at an early age. So being able to hear and be able to flexibly respond to those kinds of questions. We also have a whole curriculum around question answering. So for instance, in one interaction, I could say, so what's a hammer? A tool. And what's a type of tool? A hammer. And so then I could say, I could point to something unrelated, like a square. And I could say, so is this a tool? Yes or no? No. And then I could point to a hammer. Is this a tool? Yes. Or I could say, so a hammer is a tool. Good. And a type of tool is a hammer. So there's a lot of ways to train the flexibility around interacting with a concept that when you get that and then you train it in one way and then you test a bunch of novel term definition relationships, and we get it generatively, which means that kids can do it with untrained things. Then I know now I can use that to teach concepts kids really need to know, as part of their instruction. So we actually train children to be able to be part of a direct instruction sequence, because if you can't do flexible question answering, we can't use direct instruction. And if we can't use direct instruction, then we can't train kids concepts as well, as we could if we were able to use those kinds of that kind of strategy. So that's just an example of what I mean about training how kids to learn a concept.
And with like language for learning and language for thinking, which is, it's available in many schools.
Yes.
There is a lot of that.
Right.
Hammer is a tool and types of tools. And for many of the people listening, this is well past what their children or clients can do. So kids with autism have very high levels of learning disabilities and learning differences. And I would propose that a lot of it is based on the fact that if their language is so delayed, you can't even get to this point. So you kind of have to say, but let's talk about the kids that do have almost conversational language, do have pretty good a language base. And then would you say if they have autism, how important is it for them to get a learning disability like dyslexia diagnosed or a math disability? Or do you think it in general is just a teaching issue, not really a diagnosis issue?
Yeah. So, and I recently published a book back in October of 2020. And I deal with this a lot in the book.
Let's talk about the book. What's the book's title and subtitle?
Yeah. So it's Blind Spots, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them is the title of the book.
And we will link that in the show notes.
Great. So in the book, I deal a lot with, the myth that whenever a child struggles to learn a skill, then if they struggle significantly, then there must be a learning disability. There must be something wrong with their ability to learn. And, one of the primary dangers of that when you're talking about in the mainstream world is, a majority of kids fail academically because school doesn't work for most kids. We have a majority of children in the United States below proficiency. More than 60% are below proficiency. And when you're talking about mathematics, that rises to more than 70%.
Wow.
And when you're talking about children of color or those living in poverty, that rises to more than 80%. So, to be honest with you, school doesn't work for a majority of kids because school isn't designed based on the science behind the learning process. It's just not how it works. And unfortunately, teachers aren't trained in that either. Colleges of education don't train teachers in behavior science. And so unfortunately, teachers are trained in traditions and beliefs that oftentimes don't work. And is, again, not to the fault of the teacher. That's how they're trained. So it's schools are designed in a way that almost all but ensures that a majority of students don't master skills. So now when you're so I'm a very big proponent of bringing awareness to parents about this epidemic of overclassifying children, because when we classify kids with a learning problem, it absolves the educational context, it absolves the school of the responsibility of changing practices so that they work better. Because when you can say, oh, this kid failed because they have a learning problem, they don't have to reevaluate. No, actually, it's because we're not teaching reading the right way, or we're not allowing kids the opportunity to truly master basic math skills before we move them to advanced ones, which is really what the problem is. So to be honest with you, we could solve a lot of this by just being pragmatic in the way we design schools and train our teachers. So I think it's really important for parents to understand that. Now, when you have a child who has an actual neurological impairment that impacts their ability to learn across the board, which is what autism entails most of the time. What I'm talking about is a child who's learned everything easily in their lives, except for one area that the school is responsible for. So when you talk about kids who met all their developmental milestones on time, and they've taught themselves to do a bunch of cool stuff in their home environment, and they become proficient at video games, and they're playing sports and a musical instrument, but yet they're still struggling to learn to read, that's a red flag that it's the reading instruction, because learning disabilities actually aren't selective in that way. And that's a big myth. Our brains don't just are like somehow not wired to learn to read, but we can learn all these other complex skills. It's not true. So when kids struggle to learn to read, but have learned to do a lot of other things well, what parents should ask themselves is, why is it the thing the school's required to teach my kid the thing they struggle with, rather than everything they are doing outside of school they do really well? So that's when it's probably mythological. But when you're talking about a child who struggled to learn to talk, struggled to learn adaptive skills, struggled to learn social skills, then that is a true learning issue, because they've struggled to learn anything in their world. And a lot of their worlds had to be designed intentionally for them to learn it. Then you're dealing with something that is a real neurological learning issue. However, that still doesn't mean that autism, for instance, explains everything they struggle to learn, right? Like, why doesn't your child read? Oh, they have autism, is not an explanation. So, why doesn't your child read? Well, they may have autism, but they may also have been failed instructionally. They also may not have been given the opportunity to learn their phonic sounds and learn how to decode words properly and learn how to identify sight words. And then even beyond that, be trained in the language skills required for comprehension. So what I don't love is when, real disabilities like Down syndrome or autism, or, some of these actual impairments that are true and absolutely impact a child's ability to learn, when those become the scapegoat for everything, that's also really detrimental for a child, because it's like, rather than saying, oh, you're not reading because of your autism, it's you're not reading because you've never been properly instructed in phonics. And we need to fix that. We need to, it doesn't lend itself to effective action when everything becomes about a diagnosis, is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And some of it too is funding, because,
yes.
I have a nephew that has struggled with dyslexia. Mm-hmm. And before he was diagnosed with dyslexia, before he had an independent evaluation, which I helped push for, they were doing fluency math facts, and they were suggesting to add Cheerios to count the Cheerios for the math facts. I'm like, okay, as I'm working on my dissertation on fluency-based instruction, knowing that, right, somebody suggesting counting on your fingers, or somebody suggesting adding Cheerios so that you can, for a typically developing kid who is not reading, or to put them in one-to-one extra help time with a mom volunteer
Yeah,
who is
exactly.
practicing bad techniques. Um, so it's, I mean, how do you change systems like we've been working on for 2 decades? We both have.
Right.
We've been working on this. I've been working
Mhm.
on trying to work and change, how autism is detected and treated.
Right.
Um, it's, like for your fit learning center, like if I
Mhm.
did have a child that qualified, which my typically developing son would have when he was young because
Yeah.
he had full language, but is that all private pay? If you have a
Mhm.
learning disability, if they've already failed by the system, can they
Yeah.
get compensatory education,
Yeah.
money? It's like a lot of this is funding.
It is. And that's the thing. I mean, I will say for a kid to be classified, it does give them access to services. But here's another thing, another horrifying statistic I will tell you is that 90% of children classified with learning disabilities graduate below proficiency. So what that tells you is that all those special services, a majority, more often than not, are ineffective. Because although it might be smaller class size, even one-on-one in some instances, modified curriculum, unfortunately, even in the special education world, a majority of the time, they're not using precision teaching, direct instruction. They're not individualizing instruction. They're not measuring skills on an individual basis, not evaluating fluency. So, even if kids do get classified and qualify for services, trust me, I mean, that's 75% of my enrollment are kids who've been classified for special ed and have made zero progress in special ed. And then they enroll in fit and they move a year and 40 hours, which is pretty indicative that they don't have a learning problem. So it's just that what you're saying is absolutely true. It's that the system has to change. Teachers need better training. Teachers need need the opportunity to be trained in the science of learning and be given the freedom to apply that in their classrooms. That's the only way any of this is ever really going to change. But so FIT is privately funded more often than not, but we also have kids, like I have day placements at Fit Learning in Tri-State. Where kids come to fit for school instead of going to school. And most of those kids are funded by the DOE. And it's
Department of
of
Education.
education.
And when you say tri-state, what states are you talking about? Just
Oh,
for
sorry. Yeah. Well, when I say tri-state, I mean New York and Connecticut. Those are my
because
two
when I
areas.
say tri-state, it's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. It's
That's
hard.
hilarious. That's your
And we have
tri-state.
people listening from all over the world. So, and you said you do have a couple fit learning in other countries.
Yes. So we have some fit learning locations in Canada, Australia. There's one in London, Ireland. Am I forgetting any? I think those are our international locations. So yeah, Canada, Ireland, the UK, and Australia
Okay.
are the
So
international ones.
can people do fit learning online?
Yeah. So, we actually made the transition to virtual instruction quite easily because we've been providing that since 2014. So, we've expanded massively over the last 5 years. But before we expanded this way, it was very hard for a lot of families to access location because we didn't have that many. So we started doing virtual instruction on Skype, years ago. And of course, obviously, then we switched to Zoom because it was way better. But so when COVID hit, we were already set up for this. We've been doing this for a long time. So we have lots of kids who never walk in a lab, like we call them learning labs, but who never walk into a center because they can't access one. They're too far away. So we have a lot of virtual enrollments at FIT. Absolutely. Now you have to qualify for that. If you have kids who are some behavioral barriers, non-compliance, those kids don't work as well on Zoom, and so they qualify for virtual enrollments based on an assessment that we implement virtually. And so if they don't qualify for virtual, then we try to find the closest location and see what we can make work for a family. But I'll be honest with you, more often than not, kids do really well on virtual instruction.
Mm-hmm. And what age chronologically do kids have to be? Or do they have to be school age? You talked about 3 to 5.
3. No,
Okay.
so we start kids at 3 years old. Now we don't have many. Now we have a couple we call them little fits. We have a couple of them on virtual instruction, but more often than not, those little guys, they need to be live. So we have, especially our 3 to 4 year olds. We have a lot of 5-year-olds on virtual. They're great, but 3 to 4 year-olds, they haven't learned how to be a learner yet. They're learning how to follow instructions and attend, and so those kids need live enrollments most of the time. But so we start at 3 years old. Yeah, we have an early literacy and early numeracy programs for little guys. We do a lot of language work with little kids. We get them kind of school proof, I guess you could say. Get them ready to go into a school environment and succeed regardless of the teacher they have that year or the school they might be in. So,
right.
Yeah, it's like prevention, a lot of prevention work.
Yeah. And I've even, recommended for, 4-year-olds with autism, teach them to read while we have them at home, that are doing pretty well, that have language. And, there's one book called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. Which is $15 book. And, or there's programs like Head Sprout, and that can assist with scientifically proven strategies. What we're talking about, direct instruction and precision teaching, all embedded with that. But at the same time, I'm saying that I also have seen where, you have an 8-year-old with severe autism and behavioral issues, and the school or the parent are pushing reading and math, writing. And it's like, I think that's putting the cart before the horse. I think our main focus should be on language and reducing problem behaviors so that they can, get potty trained and do functional skills. And, if they're very obsessed with letters or want to read, that's one thing. I'm not saying like hide that from them, but it can also be a problem when people are pushing academics when the language isn't there. Do you agree?
I do. I mean, I will say, obviously, when you do the work that we do, I'm all about component skills. So I'm first things first person. I'm a prerequisites. Ultimately I'm an instructional designer. So I spend my career studying complex repertoires and breaking them down into component essential pieces. So, obviously, if you have an 8-year-old who isn't potty trained, is engaging in severe problem behavior, your primary focus should be, adaptive skills and functional communication, so that the child has something to do as an alternative to tantruming and aggressing and things of that sort. On the other side, I will say that is particularly reading. Reading can open up a lot of doors for kids who are on the spectrum in such a way that they may have difficulty acquiring higher level language skills. That may never happen. But what I have found is reading can be a really powerful reinforcer for kids on the spectrum, even if they never move past very simple books, but it's also something that they can do in free time, to give them a variety of free time activities in their daily lives that can be really enriching and reinforcing. So on that side, I would say reading plays that role for those kids. I find, and again, from my early days when I was working with, very low functioning kids on the spectrum, or very young kids on the spectrum who just started intervention, I find textual prompts to be one of the most powerful tools for rapidly fading prompts and training complex repertoires. So, another reason I would recommend, if it works, to get basic decoding and reading skills going with kids on the spectrum, is so that textual prompting can be used as a really effective prompting strategy that can easily be faded. I find textual prompts to be unbelievably effective. So it gives you access to another type of teaching tool when a child can read. Again, I'm not saying they're going to be comprehending and reading at a 4th grade level, but they could be reading, basic words, and then that could give access, to free time activities and to different types of teaching strategies that their therapists can use. But I do agree with you in a large way that you got to focus on first things first with kids.
Yeah. And I know that many children with autism, including my son, are hyperlexic. They actually
Right.
really like letters and numbers and can read.
Yes.
And I just did a podcast a few weeks ago. We can link in the show notes about hyperlexia and how we can use it.
Yes.
If it's there for textual prompts and
Mhm.
I developed this book program, which are in my courses, and it's basically taking books and making really powerful natural environment teaching sessions, not to have to like pre-plan everything so rotely, but to get children, even if they can't read the text, to use very simple books and to build in language comprehension by
Yes.
questions. And during COVID, because part of my book program is to go to the library once a week and to get 5 books and to swap them out. And, that's an activity. So of course, libraries were closed. So during COVID, somebody suggested this app called Epic, EPIC, and it's a monthly fee, but you can have a wide range of books. And I know that that's a leisure activity for Lucas, is
Very
to
much so.
read these little books, like first grade books. And you
Mhm.
might think, well, he's 25, he's reading. Hey, it's fine. He's happy.
Yes.
He is engaged. He can answer simple questions, and it can't hurt the situation.
Right.
And then if
Right.
you have like a new activity, like you're going on a plane or you're going to the dentist, you can get a first grade reader about
Yep.
those activities. And it will also help the children kind of anticipate what's coming.
And getting off those iPads. I mean, those electronic devices have, become like the primary free time activity. And, I'm not saying we don't need those reinforcers to build other skills, but it's so nice to have something that's not electronic, that doesn't involve all of that stuff that can really evoke more stereotypy, more echolalia, more ritualistic behavior. Books can be a really nice break
Mhm.
from
And now
those
that
other
we
kinds
can
of
get back to
reinforcers.
the libraries in some
Yes.
situations, it is a good thing to think about. So,
Yep.
um, okay, so I really appreciate you coming on and just telling us,
Mhm.
that there are alternatives when kids are kind of stuck, not doing well, failing,
Right.
um, want to go to places like Fit Learning where they
Mhm.
can improve skills. It's scientifically based,
Yep.
uh, behavioral, and proven. I mean, make
Yep.
one whole year of leap forward in 40 hours of instruction. And I've seen it. I've seen it
Yep.
in uh, when you really focus on the right things in the right order, you can
Mhm.
make really, really amazing progress. And I think your students are very lucky that you and your husband and others have
Yes.
paved the way. And hopefully, at I'm sure this is part of your mission, but I'm sure it's already happening when Johnny goes to Fit Learning and makes those gains. And then, especially if the Department of Education is funding it, and they'll be like, whoa, what is
Mhm.
happening? Like the goal is really to make all of instruction be like this,
Yes.
to
Yes.
make it positive, to make it productive, to get kids proficient or above. And it hasn't been happening. But hopefully, with the efforts like you are showing us, it can move in the right direction. So thank you for all of your work in this field.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So we're gonna put the name of your book. Is How can they find out about Fit Learning? Is there a
Yeah.
website easy to say?
Yeah. So if you can go to www.fitlearning.com.
Okay.
That's the easy one. So that's all, there are links you'll find links to all about our program, to all our different locations. There's, it's easy to be able to reach out to a specific location that's in your area for more information. And then I have a website. So that's www.drkimberlyberens.com. And that's where you'll find information on my book, other op-ed. I've written a bunch of stuff for Popular Press on some of these things. I've had a bunch of video, interviews and other podcasts. So all of my stuff is on the Dr. Kimberly Berens website.
Okay, Dr. Kimberly Berens, BERENS.com and fitlearning.com. We'll put that in the show notes along with your book called Blind Spots. And all of that will be in the show notes at marybarbera.com/143. So one more question before I let you go. Part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. So what kind of stress reduction techniques or self-care tools do you suggest for our listeners?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, I think first, one of my biggest, one of the things I find to be the most rewarding inside of my career is creating a distinction for a parent. And one of the most important distinctions, and I've gotten this from Pat Fryman, who's another one of my mentors, Dr. Fryman, he's in the field, is debunking the myth of normal. I think that one of the things we tend to do as parents, especially, is compare our kids to other kids and constantly beat ourselves up when we do those comparisons. And this could be whether or not we have a neurotypical kid or a child on the autism spectrum or a child with another type of disability. And so I always say, catching ourselves doing that and being aware that normal is actually a lie. There is no normal. Like, there is no kid who gets up in the morning and gets themselves dressed perfectly and cleans up after themselves and eats everything for breakfast that they're supposed to. And, all the Gerber baby, like, that's not real. So I think what I find to be helpful for myself as a mother, and I found helpful with my clients that I work with, is, really being present to that every day, that there is no normal kid, that, individual differences define human beings. We're more different than we are similar in so many ways. The way, how quickly we learn a skill, how, what it takes to learn that skill, that's actually normal, that it's different across all kids. And the rate of progress is different across all kids. And so my recommendation is stop comparing your child to other kids and focus on the personal best, and this is what I teach my learners. This is what I teach my parents, that rather than comparing yourself to someone else, it's like compare yourself to yourself yesterday. Have your child practice comparing themselves to who they were yesterday. So did I make a personal best today? Did I do a few more minutes of my homework assignment, without having to be reminded? Did I pick something up off the floor without having to be asked? Did I, whatever it might be, did I fight a little harder in my hockey game, and persevere through a tough moment in a moment with a friend? So it's all, fit learning, we're all about the personal best. And also for ourselves as parents, like, was I a little more patient today than I was yesterday? Was I a little more accepting and generous today than I was yesterday? Rather than, am I as patient as, my friend Laura is with her kids? So I think that the frame of comparison we all tend to automatically engage in, it can be toxic. Mm-hmm. So, my biggest advice is stop doing that. Compare yourself to yourself and set goals for yourself, whether it be as a parent or a friend or whatever it may be. And then focus on your personal best goals and compare yourself to those. And then also, if you don't meet it, then guess what? You have the opportunity to try again the next day, man. And it doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. So that's my advice.
I totally agree. In fact, my new book, dedicate my book to my sons, who taught me there is no such thing as normal.
Yes, there we go.
So we totally are on the same page with that. And, we just do the best we can every day, and we try to do better tomorrow with the information. So thanks so much for your time today. I really enjoyed meeting you and chatting with you. I know my listeners are going to too. So all the show notes, marybarbera.com/143, and I'll see you right here next week.